Idea of the King's Indian attack, basically playing a King's Indian defence with an extra tempo, started to become popular in the 1950s. The King's Indian defence, that's where black plays knight f6 and g6 against the queen's pawn, was of course very dominant after World War II, thanks to the efforts of masters such as Boleslavsky, Geller, Bronstein and so on. And so masters of course had the bright idea, well, why not play this system with an extra move? So it was only in the 1950s really that this opening started to attain a degree of popularity. Now, there are several ways to get into a King's Indian attack position, but for the purposes of this DVD, I'm going to focus on lines where white plays 1e4. And really, I think the King's Indian attack is only effective after 1e4 against the French defence and against the Sicilian defence. It's often used against the Caro-Can defence. You can do this, but black has a more comfortable time of it in that system. I'll try to show why. I will show a couple of games in the Caro-Can, but I should warn you that there are several effective ways of handling the black side in that opening. But for the time being, let's concentrate on what makes the King's Indian attack an attractive proposition for us. Well, the first thing is that the typical plan of development is easy to understand and play. White is going to set up with knight f3, g3, bishop g2, castles, d3, and then knight bd2. He'll then look to take his position further. And I think, well, if I take play on a little bit, we'll get to the basic position against the French defence here, and then we'll have a little discussion of what's happening. All right, well, in the French, essentially, white is strong pointing e4 in this particular system. He's not going to play e5 until he's good and ready. He's just securing that pawn. And black normally comes forward on the queen side with c5. There are other methods, and we will examine them a bit later on, but for the time being, let's take the absolutely classical situation here, where white castles and black does likewise. All right, well now, white must have a very clear idea of how to take this position further. And so to start off with, an absolutely classic demonstration of the King's Indian attack in action, a game between Bobby Fischer and the Mongolian master Miag Marusan. Now this game was played in the Seuss Interzonal in 1967. You may have seen this game before, but it is definitely worth running over again and again, because it's a really important game, showing most of white's ideas. Well, the King's Indian attack is so named because white is looking to attack black, basically, on the king side. And he starts to do this with the advance e5. Now, white could prepare that move with rook e1. But Fischer is obviously not afraid of playing e5 straight away. Black drops his knight back to d7, and now white plays rook e1, strong pointing the pawn on e5. This pawn really is the linchpin of white's attack. Behind this pawn, white hopes to build his forces up for a successful attack against the black king. Black must not sit there and let it happen, and he usually develops counterplay on the queen side with the help of the move b5. I have seen slower methods adopted, for instance with moves like b6, but this is a typical club player's mistake. This move is simply too slow. What black generally finds a bit later on down the line is that he has to play b5 anyway. So masters think that the best way to do it is to play that move straight away. Just dropping back one move. Black can obviously try to train his sights on the pawn at e5 with queen c7. Then I think white would play queen e2. And once again, black has to think about queenside counterplay. This small interlude with queen c7 and queen e2 doesn't really change things very much. So Miag Marusan thinks, well, why not start counterplay without delay? Okay, now comes another typical move, knight to f1. b4 getting on with the job. And now h4 by white. Well, the first point of knight f1 is to make the move bishop f4 possible. White doesn't necessarily want his queen on e2 in all lines, so if black were to play queen c7, white would simply reply with bishop f4. The second point of knight f1 is to reintroduce that knight into the game via h2, or possibly via e3. After that, the knight could think about coming to the square g4 to aid the kingside attack. So that knight is really not going to stay on f1 for very long. So you can see white is building up his attack slowly but methodically by these means. And black really can't do anything other than just advance on the queen side, which is what Maag-Murison does by playing a5. Now, another very nice point of having the rook on e1 in this position is that the classic break in the French f6 is dissuaded. If black were able to play f6 in a position where the rook was on e1, obviously the pawn on e6 will become very weak. So black has to watch out for that pawn all the way along the line if he plays f6. There is another little idea which Fischer plays in this game to restrain f6 a little later on, involving the move bishop h3. And that's another key moment in this game. But for the time being, let's note that f6 is kind of dissuaded. So white continues to build up with a steady move, bishop f4, overprotecting e5 and, well, freeing up the f3 knight to a certain extent. I mean, white might think about now moving that knight up to g5, and then who knows, maybe the queen could come out to h5, and as you can see, the attack is building up. Seeing no threats, black gets on with the job on the queen side, a4. And now Fischer played a move which was actually revolutionary at the time of this game, the quiet little move a3. You wouldn't believe it, but that move is a major contribution to King's Indian attack theory. Formerly, white was just playing a move like knight 1 h2, continuing to build up, allowing black to play a3. And the problem with this little sequence from white's point of view is that he now has weak squares on c3 and d4. All things considered, it's better to prevent black from playing a3 if white can. The black pawn on a3 also sets up certain endgame disadvantages from white's point of view. So Fischer took a very cool look at the position and decided to play a3. And black, I think quite correctly, opens up lines on the queen side by taking on a3. Alright, knight a5. There are obviously different ways for black to try to create pressure on the queen side, but there's no obvious target for black to concentrate on there, and white has something of a free hand on the king side, which Fischer intensifies by playing knight to e3. Another good move, I think white could have considered knight 1 to h2 in this position. That's another way of building up the pressure. Probably black was going to play c4 then, and if white blocks with d4, black comes on with gaining space with c3. And then you see black's got the idea of playing knight to c4, putting pressure on a3. So knight e3, I think, is a more accurate square for the knight. Not a clumsy square at all. d4 by black is rather unattractive. However, Maag-Murison plays this move quite soon. And black is being talked out of playing c4. I think if black plays that move, the long diagonal opens up, and then the bishop on g2 would start to become a very strong piece. Note also the knight on e3 could still come to g4 if needed. And also, there's an interesting point here. Black plays queen to c7, for instance, then strikes like knight takes d5 become available. That's another very thematic idea in the King's Indian attack when you've got a bishop on f4 and black's queen is on c7. That's another trick you can tend to pull. So going back to knight e3, black decided to play bishop a6, trying to get the move a c4 in. And now Fischer played bishop h3. Increasing the pressure, a very good move, dissuading black from playing f6 and threatening to increase the pressure further with the help of the move knight g5, when black has to look after a whole complex of squares around his king. d4. Well, you would think, having played knight a5 and bishop a6, that black was going to play c4 in this position, but I suppose after that white would just shut the queen side down by playing d4. And you see now how difficult it is for black to get counterplay. White's attack is far quicker than black, and Black cannot block the kingside, whereas white seems to have quite effectively shut down black's queenside pressure for the time being. So going back to bishop h3, black changes the nature of the game by playing d4. Knight f1. Now that is a move which raised a few eyebrows at the time, and it seems so automatic to play knight g4 in this position. That's so thematic in the King's Indian attack, and it looks more natural. Well, the thing is that I think the reason Fischer played knight f1 in this position, if we just compare the two moves, is that he's leaving the way open for his queen to join the attack via h5. This is a profound idea. Black played knight b6, white played knight g5, and now you have to compare the position with the queen ready to come to h5 with perhaps the position where there would be a white knight on g4 in this position. The knight on f1 can still be introduced into the game, and Fischer obviously considered that it was far more effective in this position to get that queen on h5 without delay. Alright, that's a judgment call. Black played knight d5. Bishop d2. Well, alright, with the white pieces massing on the king's side, then queen h5 was definitely an interesting move. That seems to be a logical continuation of white's plan, and in fact after h6 only move, white can consider strikes like knight takes f7. Well, I think after that black had possibly prepared knight takes f4, and this is an interesting rejoinder. If g takes f4, rook takes f7, bishop takes e6, black can defend himself with the help of a move like queen e8, with king f8 to come. Moreover, if we go back to knight takes f4, if white decides to throw caution to the winds here, with knight takes h6, g takes h6, and now g takes f4, I think black can get away with the move king g7 in this position. And he defends. So Fischer shows patience, just retreats the bishop to d2, maintains attacking chances, and invites black to find a good answer to the coming queen h5. Well, quite naturally, black takes the knight. And white recaptures with the bishop. H takes g5. Well, that would be the type of move you would play with a white knight on g4. If you can imagine the knight on f1 on g4, well then we're thinking about sacrifices like knight f6 check to open up the black king. But with the knight a long way from g4, Fischer decides to keep things more fluid with bishop takes g5 in the full knowledge that f6 is unplayable. So black's got to find another square for his queen, and he does so with queen d7. Incidentally, one point I just should mention here after f takes g5, there is the possibility for white to attack the square h7 in a position of this type. But it takes a long time for him to mass his pieces on the h file. He would need to play queen h5 1, king g2 2, then he'd have to get his knight out of the way, knight h2 to g4, that's 4 moves, rook comes to h1, and even then he's got to get the bishop out of the way. By that time, black will be able to drop a knight back to f8. I think that's black's basic defensive scheme in a position of this type. If he drops a knight back to f8, he can defend that square h7. So again, another compelling reason why white should take with the bishop. And black played queen d7. Queen comes out to h5, and black prepares for his counterplay with rook fc8. Now, it is very difficult to criticise black's moves in this game. I mean, you know, you're playing a very strong opponent. You might feel intimidated. You're trying to do the best you can and find moves which develop counterplay. But possibly, black should have chosen the move bishop b7 here. And the idea of that is to create some counterplay on the long diagonal and possibly keep the option of f6 open. However, you know, this sort of thing becomes obvious only after the game, when the position has been analysed at length. And when you're playing at the board, you've got to make decisions all the time. Rook fc8 looks okay. Alright, knight d2. That knight is now heading to the key square e4. Once that knight gets to e4, then, you know, there'll be plenty of very nice options at the knight's disposal. So black puts his knight in on c3 to dissuade white from playing knight e4. And now comes a typical King's Indian sacrifice, bishop f6. This is a very nice move, and again, very, very thematic. If black takes the bishop, white can jam up the black king position. Let's see this in action. Let's say black does take this. We take back with the pawn. Okay, white's threatening queen g5 check, so black has to play a move like king h8. Then comes knight f3. It's very noticeable in this position how ineffective the black pieces are on the queen side. They're doing absolutely nothing. Well, white's threatening knight g5 here, so black has to play rook g8. And now I think knight e5 is just a crushing move. Black has had no time to redeploy his pieces for defence, and the knight on e5 has set up a winning fork. So it turns out, going back to bishop f6, black simply can't take that bishop, and he played queen e8, whereupon now white sticks his knight in on e4. Okay, g6. Well, of course, black could take the knight straight away. I don't think that would change things very much from the game. White would certainly take back with the rook. And white's threatening to intensify the pressure with rook g4. Something very similar happens in the game as black jabs at the white queen. Queen comes into g5. Once again, you know, this is another position where tempting moves are definitely available. You know, how many of us would simply play queen h6 on autopilot there? Well, black can defend himself actually there by queen f8. So queen g5 again is a very patient move. White says to black, look, I've got all my pieces in the right area, it's just a question of time. I just need to build up the pressure a little bit more. Well, black takes off the knight. Rook takes, and now pawn up to c4. Well, once again, you know, black does have alternatives. He can try and move like bishop b7 here. Then white would swing his rook across to g4. And black has two ways to try and defend this position. If he goes on to full defence here, with a move like queen f8, then I think white just ploughs through with h5. The only real reason to put the queen on f8 is to make h6 available here. And then after queen h4, to try and get rid of the white queen by playing g5. But the problem is black is so passive in this position that white has all the time in the world to build up his attack. He hasn't even got a sacrifice in this position with bishop takes g5. He can just play f4. And if black plays bishop f3, well, then we go f takes g5, bishop takes g4, queen takes g4, h takes g5, queen takes g5, check, king h7, and now just a simple switch back with bishop g2 wins, because white's threatening bishop e4 check. It really is noticeable how helpless the pieces on the queen side are when it comes to defending the black king. So I think the variation after bishop b7 and then queen f8 is pretty clear cut. Let's just go back to rook takes e4 and run that one more time. Bishop b7, rook g4. Now how about queen c6? That move definitely looks tempting, with black threatening checkmate on h1. But then, you know, I just think king h2 is a very effective move. All the squares are covered around the white king, and white is threatening the simple move, queen h6, and I don't see a defence to that move. So going back to the game, this is why the guy plays c4. Well, h5. The time is coming. I mean, that rook now can come into the game via h4 if needed, which is exactly what happens. C takes d3, and now rook h4. And that move sets up an immediate threat of pawn takes pawn, followed by rook takes h7. For instance, let's just take a pawn on c2, convince ourselves this is right. Take on g6, rook takes h7. I think you'll find that move is completely convincing. and leads to mate. So black has no time to realise his material advantage on the queen side. Thus, the Mongolian tries to defend himself by rook a7. He could also try rook c7 in this position, in which case there is another very interesting little combination here from white. Bishop takes e6. I think this is a really good move. If black takes with the queen, queen h6 mate. If he takes with the f pawn in this position, we go h takes g6. Again, what is black to play? I mean, white's just simply threatening to strip open his king. If queen takes g6, we go queen takes, h takes, rook h8 check, king f7, rook h7 check, king e8, and now the prosaic move, rook takes c7, which I think you will find wins. So, well, actually, you know, white's threat is basically to introduce the rook on a1 into the game quite quickly by king g2 and then rook h1. So black has no time for that either. So he went rook a7, and now Fischer unleashed a famous combination, one that has found its way into the tactical anthologies. He played bishop g2. Mieg Murison took on c2. White went queen h6, queen f8, and now this superb move, queen takes h7. Well, who would not be attracted by that move? The point is that after king takes h7, we take on g6 double check, and then we play this beautiful checkmate with bishop e4. Just going back to the position after bishop g2, let's run that combination once again, because black can possibly defend a little bit better by playing bishop b7. Well, if he does that, we revert to our other idea of taking on g6 and then taking on h7. Again, this wins. And one last little look. Queen h6. If c1 equals queen, trying to deflect the white queen away from the action, we go rook takes c1, rook takes c1 check, and now the superb move king h2. There's no need to take that rook on c1. White's threat of queen takes h7 and the same checkmate we saw in the game decides. So that was the type of game which gave the King's Indian attack a very good name back in the 1960s, and suddenly everybody started to play it. Perhaps black didn't defend himself effectively and optimally in this game, but that game gives you a good idea of many thematic ideas in this opening, and well, a reason for actually playing this line. It's not that easy for black to beat back the white attack.